The selection chamber of Vethori Apex Command had been designed to establish context before a word was spoken. This was intentional. The room's architecture communicated, through ceiling height and material and the precise distance between the candidate's chair and the commander's desk, that the person entering it was being assessed by an institution that had existed for 140 years and had refined its standards over that period with the unsentimental efficiency of something that understood exactly what it was selecting for. The walls carried the unit's operational record in the form of authenticated mission seals, not decorative, not ceremonial, simply present, the way significant facts were present when an institution felt no need to argue for them. Rael Vor-Kethis had sat behind the desk in this room for 19 years. She had, in that time, interviewed 417 candidates. She had selected 61. The third candidate of the current selection cycle was a human. She had known this from the Q manifest. She had noted it with the specific, practiced neutrality of a commander who had been running selections long enough to know that her initial assessments were hypotheses rather than conclusions, and who had been wrong about candidates in both directions, often enough to have built in a genuine delay between first impression and determination. The delay was principled. It was also, in practice, shorter for some candidates than others, and the human's file had provided information that made the hypothesis form quickly. 8 years of service, no augmentation records, a physical profile that read, to her eye, as young in the way that human youth presented, which was different from Vethori youth, but still registered as a gap between appearance and the weathering she expected in candidates who were applying to this unit seriously. She had seen quota fillers before. She knew how to recognize the specific quality of a candidate whose application represented a political decision made above their own pay grade. Someone who was present not because they believed they belonged here, but because a diplomatic process had concluded that a human candidate in the apex selection pool was a useful thing regardless of outcome. She processed these candidates with the same formal thoroughness she applied to everyone. She eliminated them with the same documentation. She felt no particular satisfaction in the elimination. It was simply the maintenance of a standard that her unit's operational record justified maintaining, and she was not apologetic about that, and had never been asked to be by anyone whose opinion she considered operationally relevant. She reviewed the human's file for 4 minutes before calling him in. Standard preparation time. The notes in the margin were sparse. The Personnel Division's summary described his service record in terms she read as competent and unremarkable. She was not expecting the interview to take long. Sergeant Declan Rourke came into the selection chamber with the particular gait of someone who had been in a significant number of official rooms and had made peace with them. Not swagger, nothing that announced itself, but the quality of someone moving through an environment they recognized the category of, without the need to perform awareness of it. He sat in the candidate chair when directed and looked at her with the flat, direct attention of someone who was paying full attention and not using any of it to manage an impression. She noted this. She proceeded. The early portion of the interview was standard, service history, unit assignment, technical certifications, and he answered each section in the economy of someone who understood what was being asked and addressed it without embellishment. His answers were accurate to his file. They did not expand on it in ways that attempted to reframe it. She was beginning to calibrate, someone who said what was true and left the interpretation to the listener, which was a quality she encountered in experienced soldiers and in certain kinds of very young ones, and needed to determine which applied here. She arrived at the question she asked every candidate. She had refined it over 19 years to its current form, direct, specific, designed to produce a number and the number's context simultaneously. She asked it with the edge she used for candidates she did not expect to answer it well, because the edge produced authentic responses more reliably than neutral delivery did, and authentic responses were what the question was for. How many actual combat engagements have you participated in? She had a mental model of the distribution of answers she received. Most species soldiers, 2 to 5, across careers of varying length, the higher numbers associated with veterans who had served in particularly active periods of their civilization's military history. Her own career, 40 years, highly decorated, 4. The number she considered exceptional, the number that had appeared in this chair perhaps 12 times in 19 years, 10. The human looked at her with the flat attention that had not changed since he sat down and said, 32. She heard the number. She processed the number. She did not immediately respond to the number, because the response that was available to her in the first 2 seconds was not the response of a commander evaluating a candidate, and she needed the version that was. Repeat that, she said. 32 distinct combat engagements, he said, in the same tone, the tone of someone providing a clarification rather than an emphasis, the tone of someone who had said the number before and found it to be the number across an 8-year service period. The selection chamber did not change. The mission seals on the walls did not rearrange themselves. The desk between them maintained its precise dimensions. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago, and everything in the room was different, because she was a military commander who understood numbers, and the number she had just received was not fitting into the framework she was attempting to place it in. She was aware that her posture had changed. She was aware of this because she had spent 40 years developing the specific physical discipline of a commander for whom composure was operational, whose face and body were tools of the leadership function, calibrated to convey what she chose and withhold what she didn't. The awareness that the calibration had slipped was itself information, and she filed it precisely. She had not expected the number. She had not expected anything in the range of the number. The gap between expectation and reality was large enough that her body had registered it before her command response had caught up. She looked at him. He was still looking at her with the same flat attention. He had not performed the number. He was not watching for her reaction with the anticipatory quality of someone who had led with a boast. He had stated a fact and was waiting, with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting, for the next question. She asked the next question. Break that down, she said, by theater and time frame. He did. He did it from memory, in the specific shorthand of someone who had filed the information in their head, the way operational soldiers filed information that might be asked for, organized, accessible, delivered without the retrieval lag of someone reconstructing it from narrative. By theater, 6 deployments in active ground conflict zones, 4 in naval support operations. The remainder in a category he translated as combined arms and asymmetric, with the explanatory addition that the translation was approximate because the Vethori classification system didn't have an exact match for the operational type. By time frame, all within his 8 years of service, with the first engagement occurring 14 months into his enlistment. She did the arithmetic as he spoke. She could not help doing the arithmetic. She was a commander. Arithmetic about operational tempo was a reflex she could not turn off any more than she could turn off breathing. The arithmetic produced a rate. She calculated it twice because the first result was a number she was attempting to verify before she accepted it. 32 engagements, 8 years. The rate, accounting for his first 14 months as a non-combat period, was approximately 4 combat engagements per year, for 7.5 years. Her civilization's military doctrine, developed over centuries, refined by the input of psychologists and medical researchers and operations analysts who had studied the cost of lethal engagement on the soldiers who survived it, mandated a minimum of 7 years between combat deployments. This was not a performance standard. It was a welfare standard, built on the understanding that the psychological cost of lethal engagement was finite per individual, and that returning soldiers to combat before they had processed the previous engagement's cost was a form of institutional consumption that destroyed what it was using. She had 4 deployments in 40 years. The doctrine had produced her, and she was the result it was designed to produce: decorated, stable, capable of commanding at the highest level of her civilization's military apparatus, still in possession of the psychological architecture she had started with. This human had accumulated 32 engagements in 8 years. "What?" she said, and then stopped, because the question she was forming was not a standard selection interview question, and she needed to determine whether she was asking it as a commander or as something else. She determined she was asking it as a commander. The distinction mattered. Everything about how she handled the next part of this conversation would be shaped by whether she approached it as a commander gathering operational intelligence, or as a person reacting to information that had disturbed her. "By your own assessment," she said, "by the standards of your military, your unit, your peers, was 32 engagements in 8 years exceptional?" He took a moment, not the performed moment of someone constructing a diplomatic answer, the genuine moment of someone actually considering the question, which was a different quality, and she could read the difference after 19 years. "Somewhat above average for my unit," he said. "Some of my colleagues had more. The number wasn't, I didn't include it as a highlighted credential in my application because it didn't seem like a distinction. It's a service record." She looked at him. She was a commander with 40 years of experience, and she was looking at a man who had just told her that 32 combat engagements was not, by his own assessment, a distinction, that it was simply what had happened during 8 years of service, the background condition rather than the notable achievement. "Some of your colleagues had more," she said. "A few," he said. She became aware, in the specific way she became aware of things she was going to need time to process, that the assumption she had brought into the interview, the assumption of inexperience, of quota-filling, of a candidate who would be eliminated in the first 10 minutes, had not survived contact with the information she had just received. She was sitting across from someone who had more direct battlefield experience than her entire senior command staff combined. She had held her contemptuous opening question until the candidate established their own inadequacy. The candidate had answered it with 32, in the flat tone of a man for whom 32 was not an argument. The contempt she had walked in with was not available to her anymore. She was in the process of determining what was available instead, and the determination was taking longer than she was comfortable with. "We're going to take a break from the formal selection structure," she said, in the voice she used for operational decisions. "I have questions that are outside the standard process, and I want to ask them directly. Are you willing to continue on that basis?" He looked at her with the flat attention that had been consistent throughout and said, "Yes." She had a question she had been building toward, and she asked it in the direct way she conducted everything once she had established that directness was the appropriate register. "What is the interval between engagements in your service record?" "Average if you calculate it." He did the calculation. She watched him do it, the specific internal quality of someone running arithmetic on information stored in their head, arriving at a result, checking it. "About 11 weeks," he said, "between distinct engagements." He paused, with the quality of someone deciding whether to add information rather than the quality of someone performing consideration. Some of those were consecutive. Engagements running adjacent or overlapping in the same operational period. She had been preparing for a number in weeks rather than years. She had known, from the arithmetic she had already done, that the interval was going to be weeks. The preparation had not fully absorbed the arrival of the number, because there was a difference between knowing that something was going to be true and hearing it stated. "Consecutive," she said. "Yes," he said. It depended on the operational situation. Sometimes a conflict resolved and there was a separation before the next deployment. Sometimes they were running. She looked at him steadily. "Your civilization's military doctrine," she said. "What is the mandatory recovery interval between combat deployments?" He paused again, the genuine pause of someone making a determination, not a performed one. It's not structured the same way yours appears to be, he said. There are rotation standards, time in theater, time out of theater. But it's not built around a minimum interval between specific engagements the way your question implies. It's built around a rotation cycle for the unit as a whole. And psychologically, she said, what support is provided between engagements for individual soldiers? Now the pause was longer. She noted the length of it because information lived in pauses as much as in answers. It varies, he said finally. There's a standard of care that exists on paper. What it looks like in practice depends on the unit, the command, the resources available at a given posting. He met her eyes steadily. It's not always what it should be. She absorbed this. She absorbed it carefully, as a commander, because what she was being told was operational information about a system she had never had reason to understand from the inside. Is 32 engagements in 8 years, she said, something that you consider sustainable, in terms of what it costs? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, which was unusual. She had spent 40 years reading soldiers. No, he said, and the flatness of it was different from the flatness of the previous answers, denser, carrying more weight on less language. That's not a sustainable rate. I'm not sure it's a rate anyone should be asked to sustain. I'm sitting in front of you, which means I got through it, but that's not the same as saying it was right. She considered what she had just heard. Not a soldier defending his civilization's approach. Not a soldier minimizing what had been done to him by the system he served. A soldier stating, with the same flat precision he had applied to everything else, that something was what it was. Why are you applying to this unit? She said. He looked at her. Because the Apex Command has an operational standard I haven't encountered in 8 years of service, he said. You maintain a readiness level that doesn't depend on continuous deployment to achieve. I'd like to work in an environment where I can be good at this, without it costing what it's been costing. She was quiet for a moment. The mission seals on the walls of the selection chamber sat in their century and a half of accumulated record, and Sergeant Declan Rourke sat across the desk from her, with the flat, direct attention of a man who had answered every question she had asked, including the ones she had not asked well. She had opened this interview with contempt. The contempt had been professional, the efficient contempt of a commander who had correctly identified that certain candidates were not serious and had developed a mechanism for demonstrating it quickly. The mechanism had produced, in this instance, the most disorienting answer she had received in 19 years of selection interviews. She sat with that for a moment in the honest way, not regretting the question, which had been the right question, but registering what it had actually asked versus what she had expected it to surface. She had expected it to expose his inexperience. Instead, she had exposed something else entirely, a reality about human military experience that her civilization had not had, as far as she could determine, any accurate framework for, and that she was now in possession of and would need to think about carefully before she did anything else with it. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. The formal selection process will continue, but I'm going to structure it differently than the standard. That's not a concession, it's an adjustment to gather the information I actually need. Do you understand the distinction? Yes, he said. Good, she said. He stood in the way of a man who was not performing deference but was recognizing a clear endpoint, and she watched him move toward the door with the same gait he had arrived with, the quality of someone who had been in a significant number of official rooms, who had found them survivable, who was not recalibrating his relationship to the one he was leaving. At the door he paused, not the pause of someone who had forgotten something, the pause of someone deciding whether the moment warranted what they were about to do. Commander, he said. Yes. The question you asked, he said. The one about engagements. For what it's worth, I could tell from the way you asked it that you were expecting a much lower number. I want you to know that's a reasonable expectation. By any standard I've since encountered outside my own military, it's a reasonable expectation. The number is not normal. It's been my normal, so I don't always remember that it isn't." He left. She sat in the selection chamber for a moment after the door closed, which she did not normally do. The room's silence had a different quality than it had had when the interview began, the silence of a space that had processed something and was returning to itself. She pulled up her own service record on the desk terminal. 40 years, 4 deployments, the recovery periods between them, mandatory and observed, each one logged as the doctrine required. She looked at the numbers and then looked at the blank space where they would have to be if her career had proceeded at the rate she had just been given. She tried to place herself in that space, tried to construct, from her own experience of what one deployment cost and what the recovery after it had required, what 7 years of that rate would have produced in her. She could not do it. The construction failed because the cost, multiplied, exceeded the architecture she had to model it on. She closed the terminal. She sat for another moment. Then she pulled up the file for the following day's evaluation structure and began, with the methodical attention of a commander doing her job correctly, to redesign it around the information she had. Her senior staff meeting the following morning had the specific quality of a briefing whose material had not been anticipated. She presented the number. She presented it without framing, without editorial. She stated it in the same flat register the candidate had used, because she had found, in the hours between the interview and this meeting, that framing it added something that did not belong there. The senior staff did the arithmetic. She watched them do it in the same sequence she had done it. Our minimum is 7 years. I know what our minimum is, Rael said. Not sharply. She did not run her staff sharply. Precisely. I am presenting you with the data because I am going to make a selection decision today, and the decision requires your understanding of what we are evaluating. Can you tell us, Vor-Kethis said, with the careful formality of a man asking something he was not sure was an appropriate question, what your impression was, not as a selection assessment, as a commander who has been doing this for 19 years. She thought about it in the honest way. My impression, she said, is that I am looking at a soldier whose experience base is built from conditions that our training programs cannot replicate, because our programs were designed around a model of warfare that does not account for what he has actually done. The question is whether what those conditions produced is what this unit needs. She looked at her staff. That is what today's evaluation is for. The evaluation she had redesigned was not the standard selection assessment. It was structured around the specific capabilities she needed to verify, not because she had decided to select him, but because the standard assessment had not been designed to evaluate someone whose experience profile was outside the range it was calibrated for, and using an out-of-range instrument to measure an out-of-range candidate would produce noise rather than signal. She ran it herself. What she saw over the course of 6 hours was not 32 engagements made visible. She had understood that the number was not the point. What she saw was what the number had produced. A specific, particular quality of calm under pressure that was built from repetition rather than temperament. Decision speed that was not recklessness. She had seen recklessness in candidates. She knew the signature, and this was not it. This was the speed of someone who had been in enough situations that required decisions faster than analysis, allowed that their analysis had learned to run faster. Situation awareness that was calibrated against actual lethal environments at a rate her unit's training had never had reason to attempt. She also saw the thing he had said in the interview, the one that had sat with her through the night. It's not a sustainable rate. I'm not sure it's a rate anyone should be asked to sustain. She had been watching for whether that knowledge was present in how he operated, because a soldier who had been through what his record described and had no awareness of the cost was a different candidate than one who had. It was present. It was not loud. It was not something he performed or announced, but it was present in the way he made certain kinds of decisions, in the quality of care he brought to the distinction between necessary risk and unnecessary risk, which was a distinction that some candidates with heavy combat experience lost, and which he had not. She brought him back into the selection chamber at the end of the day. The room was the same room it had been yesterday. She was not quite the same commander. "I'm going to offer you a selection," she said. "Before I do, I have a question that I'm asking as a matter of operational transparency rather than as a selection criterion. You can choose how to answer it." He waited. "You told me yesterday that 32 engagements at that rate is not sustainable," she said. "You said it's not a rate anyone should be asked to sustain. I want to know what you're looking for in this unit that you didn't have in your previous command." He was quiet for a moment, the real pause, the one that produced true answers. "Time to be good at this between operations," he said. "Your unit's readiness record suggests you maintain a capability level that doesn't require continuous engagement to sustain. I want to work in an environment where I can be effective without the cost being the whole budget." He met her eyes. "I'm 30 years old. I'd like to still be functional at 40. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things she needed to understand before she made decisions about them. And she understood him, not completely, not with the confidence she had in assessments built over longer observation periods, but adequately. Adequately was what selection decisions were built on. "You're selected," she said, "conditional on your standard probationary integration period with the unit. The conditions of that period will be briefed separately." He received this in the flat, even way he had received everything, not performing restraint, just being the particular person he was. "Thank you," he said. "Can I ask about the unit's operational tempo?" She had been, on some level, expecting this. She had been expecting it since the evening before, when she had sat with his record and thought about what a person who had been through his service record would think to ask first. She told him the deployment intervals. She told him the recovery doctrine. She watched his face receive the numbers, not the performed reception of someone hearing what they wanted to hear, but the genuine reception of someone recalibrating something they had been carrying for a long time and were in the process of setting down. "That's," he said and stopped. He looked at the desk for a moment. "That's good," he said, which was such a small thing to say about it that it contained, in its smallness, everything he was not saying, and she heard all of it. "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked out of the selection chamber at the end of the day with the file closed, and the decision logged, and the 40-year sum of her military career, sitting differently in her understanding than it had when she had walked in that morning. Not worse, her career was what it was, and she was proud of what it was, and she had built something real inside it, but in a different proportion to something she had not previously had a reference point for. She had asked a contemptuous question designed to expose inadequacy. The question had worked exactly as designed, and had exposed the thing it was designed to expose: the gap between expectation and reality in a candidate who did not fit her prior model. She had been contemptuous because she expected the gap to run in one direction. The gap had run in the other direction, and in running the other direction, it had given her the most useful piece of intelligence about human military reality she had encountered in 4 decades of working in a sector that contained humans, and she had gotten it because she had asked a sharp question and received a sharper answer.